Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. We are going to be talking once again about the topic of biodiversity net gain and what it means for the industry. So if BNG assessments are on your radar, then you're in the right place. Go ahead and let us know in the chat where you're joining us from and also what you're hoping to get from today's session. My name's Laura Drury and I work on the Sustainability Communications team here at One Click LCA. And I'm joined today by James Thornton, who is our biodiversity product specialist. I'll let James introduce himself properly in a few moments, but first I'll just take you through what you can expect from today's session. So James will start by giving a bit of background to BNG, what it is and why it's such a significant update for the industry. He'll then talk about the assessment process itself and how it's possible for those without a biodiversity background to complete those assessments. And we'll then be showing you a live demo of the One Click LCA BNG tool and the steps that are required in the assessment process. And then finally, towards the end of the session, we'll have a live Q&A with James. So please do drop your questions into the chat or questions box at any point during the session and we'll get those answered for you. So that's it from me, brief introduction. I'll now hand over to James to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. My name is James, Biodiversity Product Specialist with One Click LCA. A bit about my background is used to be an ecological consultant in the UK. So working on like a variety of developments, housing developments, all the way up to like national scale infrastructure projects, power, etc. So quite familiar with Biodiversity Net Gain and how it works with the planning system in the UK. But enough about me, let's just jump straight into it. So I just wanted to start briefly with a very simple visual demonstration of what biodiversity net gain is. So everything about biodiversity net gain is focused on habitats. So a habitat is a way of classifying areas based on their characteristics, like the different plant species present, the type of climate they're in, etc. So the difference between a grassland and a forest, those are both habitat types, but they have very different characteristics. So within biodiversity net gain, you have your habitats on your site, and then you have these three, let's call them parameters, that influence their value in biodiversity units. So you have distinctiveness, condition, and strategic significance. Distinctiveness is like representative of the relative biodiversity value at the national scale. So for one type of forest, how valuable is that across England as a whole? And that takes into account factors like species richness in that forest, like how many different plant and animal species it supports, its rarity, how much of it still exists in England, and things like that, like how fragmented the habitats might be. If there's not one big forest in good condition, but there's lots of small examples of it, it's quite fragmented, so it's potentially at risk. The second parameter is condition. So condition is a way to differentiate between the same habitats that might have differences between them. So you could have two sites that are 1 mile apart that both have the same type of forest or the same type of grassland, but they're probably unlikely to be exactly the same in terms of all the plant species present or whether they have any invasive species present, for example. So condition is the process of comparing the habitat that you have on site with an ecological optimum example of that same habitat. So if we know what the perfect example of that habitat is, we can define some criteria that describe it, and then we measure the habitat that we're looking at against those criteria. And then finally, strategic significance. This is a parameter that's semi-qualitative. but it's used to provide an extra multiplier for things that are locally more important than their national scale distinctiveness might suggest. So particularly in urban environments, this is really useful. It's not going to like magically get you 10% net gain on its own, but it's useful in improving your score if you're in an urban environment with minimal access to greenery or high quality nature. Things like low quality grasslands are probably a bit more significant in an urban environment. There are some other things that go into this depending on the habitat type, but all assessments will have these three core parameters that you will determine for each habitat on your site, and then this gives you a biodiversity unit score. The score itself is just a standardized unit developed for the sake of the framework, so it just communicates the differences in value between different habitats. It doesn't really mean anything on its own. And I actually missed at the start, but just to iterate as to why biodiversity net gain is so important right now is it's not something new, even though many people think it's new because of the recent legislation, but it's something that local councils and planning authorities have been doing for a few years already. And obviously, hopefully most people are aware now, as of February this year, it's now law for most new developments in England. Most new developments are going to be subject to this with few exemptions. And traditionally, this was something that developers would hire an ecologist for, often quite late in the process. And it inevitably causes problems. Like if you've already selected a site without having any idea of what biodiversity value is there, and you kind of already selected a detailed design maybe, and then bringing an ecologist in to look at biodiversity net gain is inevitably going to cause problems because it limits your options as to how you can actually navigate this. So the goal for us is to get stakeholders who might not be ecologists or have any idea really before they start, get them familiar with this process and start doing it really early on. But we'll go into a bit more detail about these three things. So, as I mentioned, the goal of this is for people, different stakeholders, maybe like designers or even like project managers, if they're like really, really early on, could have a look at stuff like this and just prepare yourself. Think of it as like a risk management thing. So we might be at the stage where we don't have a site selected, and we definitely don't have a design selected. So we want to look at some different sites and just start to get an idea as to what we would need to do if we use that site. So it's quite high level, but it's useful because it just streamlines the process a bit and saves you trouble down the line. So you might want to estimate the habitats on site without having a detailed survey by an ecologist at this point. And Biodiversity Net Gain uses a system of habitat classification developed by UK Hab Limited, which One-Click LCA is licensed to use. And it's a hierarchical system. So you have a top level of, let's say, a grassland. Everyone in here knows what a grassland looks like. And then you go one level down the hierarchy and you might have something like, whether it's a heavily managed grassland, so something in an urban environment in a park that's just a lawn, that's one type that's really easily determined by anyone. And then you have others that might be classified based on their soil type, for example. Another example would be woodlands, like you have the top level hierarchy is woodland or forest. And then as you move down, it's differentiated between whether it's like a broadleaf, so like oaks, ash, beech, those types of forests, or whether it's coniferous, so like pine, spruce forests. And then it gets more and more detailed as you go. So anyone is free to register on UK Hab and download the classification system that has a guide on how to identify these. And as you move through the hierarchy, it becomes more and more complex. And for the top level ones, or the lowest level ones, sorry, it's probably something for an ecologist to be doing. There's a lot of factors that go into some of these complex habitats. But for some of the easier things, there's no reason you can't start getting familiar with them. So let's say now that you're at a point where you've got like 2 or 3 potential sites, and you obviously need to know what kinds of habitats are on there for you to start doing BNG. If you can't physically go, there are some online data sources. I think off the top of my head, 2 of these are paid, but 2 of them are free. And these are geospatial data, so you would use a software like QGIS or Esri Arc, which maybe some people are familiar with, which you can overlay with satellite or ordnance survey maps and things like that, so that you can go to the site that you're looking at, and depending on which one you use, you might have an idea of a habitat type. So these are all really designed for larger scale cases than what we're talking about here, because they don't go that far down the hierarchy. However, as we're talking about like a high level assessment, it's really useful just to get you an idea, and especially if you can combine it with satellite imagery or even going to the site and taking some pictures. You can get quite far depending on the site as to what's there. So condition. So as I mentioned, this was the process of comparing your habitat with an ecological optimum example. So we have a grassland on site, and we would go to the condition assessment sheets, which were provided by the government, DEFRA, and you would find the relevant sheet for grassland. And on that, you would have, let's say, 6 criteria. And let's say if you get 2 of the 6 criteria, that's poor condition. If you have 4 out of 6, that's moderate condition. And if you achieve all of the criteria, that's good condition. And with each of those, there's an associated numerical value. And similarly with the habitat system, for certain habitats, like rare things or complex habitats, especially dynamic habitats, like anything that involves water can be quite dynamic. The criteria can be kind of complex and suited for an ecologist, whereas some of them are really quite intuitive and I would say easy for the layperson to actually go and determine some of the criteria. So I've just provided some different examples from some different habitat types. So from grassland, one of the criteria could be cover of bare ground, so there's no vegetation in little patches, is between 1 and 5%. Obviously, that's a kind of semi-qualitative 1 and 5%, like an estimate, but that's quite easy to determine. For cases of individual trees, so not a woodland, but one tree or maybe 2 or 3 trees standing together on their own, more than 20% of the tree canopy area has vegetation beneath. That's also pretty intuitive. For scrub habitats, essentially the short version is you have all the different life stages of plants are present in that area of scrub. And then for urban environments, this one's also very intuitive. A single vegetation type does not account for more than 80% of the habitat area. So essentially, there should be some variety. It's not just all concrete, or it's not just all grass. There should be a few different things present. Again, those are just examples to highlight. There will be ones that are more complicated than this, but as we're at the point of doing a high-level assessment, any kind of evidence that you can get as to the condition just makes it easier to justify why you chose that. So if you could go to site, or even if you could see from satellite some of these things to help you assign a condition score, that's just going to, again, prevent nasty surprises further down the line. And then strategic significance. This one is probably the easiest for someone who isn't an ecologist to determine. It is inherently dependent on knowing what habitats you have on site, however, but if you start a relationship with your local planning authority early and work with them, this will help you significantly. So there's kind of two initial pathways for determining strategic significance. This is quite new, but ideally from this point onwards and in the future, your local planning authority will have a local nature recovery strategy, or LNRS. This will be a document with similar geospatial data to what we mentioned previously. So they will have mapped all the biodiversity in the relevant area for them as the planning authority. So they will have areas that are highlighted for good places for development, bad places for development, and then within that they will say what types of habitats should go there, or what different features are going there. So they might have a recommendation to increase connectivity between like two protected sites, for example, and the habitat is less important. Whereas you might also have something that's right on the border of a protected site, and the habitat type that you create or enhance through your development is really important. So there's lots of different ways that the LNRS will help you achieve biodiversity net gain and decide on your significance value. And then, as this is still quite new, for some planning authorities, they might not have this yet, or they might have a draft. But if it's not available, you should still reach out to the local planning authority, and they should have something that you can use in the interim, like a previous iteration of this before it was called an LNRS, that will have a similar thing of like, here is where, if you're doing a development here, here's are the habitats that you should have on site, or avoid developing this area at all costs, etc. The third pathway that's ideally not going to be used, but it is possible, is if neither of these options are available, maybe for some reason you can't make contact with someone at the LPA. The strategic significance is semi-qualitative, and also for all of these, there's a degree of professional judgment used, but especially for significance. You can make an informed decision based on some other data or documents available. So, as I mentioned, a draft local nature recovery strategy, that would be nice. But if that's not available, there are these things like local plans, neighborhood plans, biodiversity action plans. To my knowledge, biodiversity action plans are not really maintained anymore, but it's still like better than nothing. If you don't have any idea from the LPA as to what you should assign, just find something like a biodiversity action plan. Similarly, if you're close to, or hopefully not within, a designated site for nature, they'll probably have a management plan, which will say what types of habitats they have present and what kind of actions should go into that. And then things like green infrastructure strategies in the urban environment. This will also be useful for helping you design like your post-development habitats, because they will have areas of flood risk as an example. So prioritizing things like green drainage systems, etc. So these documents can actually be quite useful at all stages of the assessment, and not just for this determining strategic significance. And then finally, just some kind of tips, I suppose, as to what I would recommend doing if you were a stakeholder or someone who's not an ecologist and you want to get familiar with biodiversity net gain, and you think what I'm suggesting is a good idea. These recommendations will probably help. So if we're at the point where we just need to do some estimates of habitat type, condition, or significance, we don't have a site selected, but we have like 2 or 3 options. We just want to get an idea. Use precaution is the key thing. So an example of that would be like assigning a condition value or a strategic significance value that's higher in your baseline, so the pre-development value, and maybe a bit lower in your post-development, so that you're prepared. You kind of prepare yourself for the worst case scenario, like I've lost all of these biodiversity units from the baseline. I really need to go the extra mile to create something new, so that if in the future you get a more detailed assessment of that site and it comes back easier, that's just going to be a lot simpler for you. The inverse of that, where you don't use precaution, you say everything on baseline is really low value, and we're just going to create some really poor habitats on site because it's easy to achieve 10%. And then a year later, you send an ecologist, and they say, actually, there's some quite high value things on site. That's not going to be good for your budget or your project's time constraints. And similarly, you could create like different versions of the same site. So as I mentioned, habitats have like an embedded distinctiveness value. So you could create different iterations of the same site, one with like low value and one with high value habitats, just to get an idea of the different scale and type of post-development habitats that you would need, whichever one turns out to be true. So again, that just prepares you, and you can start creating some different high-level designs of the landscaping or the building based on these. I think that's everything. So we can jump into how the tool looks and show like how this information is actually used. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen now. For anyone who's not familiar with One-Click LCA's platform already, this is the project page. So each of these is a different project. For BNG, I think the way that I would probably do it is have like one project for each site that you're comparing within that project. So you would have development number 1 dash site 1, for example, and create a few different projects. And then I will show you the reason why I would probably do it that way. So I've now gone into one of the projects, and these are designs. So if we have a project for each site within the development project, we can create different comparison designs, or as we move through the development, we can iterate over it and we can see how our initial assessment has grown into a more detailed assessment down the line. So you have direct comparisons between iterations of that site. If it's like a smaller project, you might just create one project and have the different sites as different designs. It's quite flexible in that regard. But I've prepared a few examples to talk about some of the like recommendations that I discussed. But let's jump into how the tool looks like. So this is what we would call the query page. We have 2 queries. So your on-site habitats and changes. On-site is defined as the actual development, like red line boundary. This is where the building is going to be. And then off-site, it's an optional query, like you don't have to complete it to complete calculation. but it's used in the instance where maybe you can't achieve a 10% net gain on site. You might need to use off-site creation or enhancement of new habitats to achieve 10% overall. Because the way that biodiversity net gain has worked is essentially like a mitigation hierarchy. So you should first avoid damaging anything altogether. If you can't avoid it, then you need to reduce how much damage you're doing. And then if you can't really reduce it, you have to compensate. So if we've lost some high value habitat on site where we're building our building, we've done everything that we can to reduce the area lost, and we've done everything we can to create new high value habitats, but we still don't achieve 10% net gain, then we probably need to get an additional site somewhere else and use that as compensation to compensate for the loss that we've done here. Hopefully you never have to use this. It would be much better if all biodiversity net gain was achieved on site. So this is how the query looks. You have 3 sections. Section 1 is habitats. It's a little bit confusing, but because everything is a habitat, but section 1 habitats are area-based habitats. So a grassland, it's something that you would measure by area, either meters squared or in BNG's case, hectares. You then have hedges, or included in hedges are like linear lines of trees. So these are like linear terrestrial habitats, hedgerows and trees. And then finally watercourses, also linear, but obviously water-based habitats. The hedges and watercourses are optional to complete because it's quite common to have sites without those, especially in the urban environment. However, if either your on-site or off-site sites have those features, then you do need to assess them, and you would complete these sections. But let's just have a look at the queries. So baseline habitats, the baseline is the pre-development. So everything that was there before you started any work whatsoever, like no clearance of anything at all. And in this example, I have 5 hectares of a type of grassland. And then created habitats. Created habitats are something where you've removed something from the baseline and you're going to make something new. So everything that you add to the baseline, so in this case 5 hectares, that's my red line boundary. I can't create more than that unless I remove some. You can't expand the boundary of your site. And then finally you have enhancement. So enhancement is where you have a condition assigned to a baseline habitat, so in this case poor, and I say that I'm going to keep 1 hectare of this grassland on site, and it will be there after the development's completed, but I'm going to improve the condition from poor to good. I'll keep it the same habitat of the neutral grassland, but I'm going to improve the condition. And the condition assessment criteria that we discussed earlier, this is really useful because it actually informs, it's basically a step-by-step guide as to how you actually do this. So when it comes to a management plan, if I want to go to poor, I know what criteria I've already achieved. So I've probably achieved 2 out of 6 criteria for it to be poor. I just need to do the other 4 to make it good. So you can turn those criteria into things that you actually need to do from a management perspective. So if one of them was, it didn't have enough species per meter squared, or there was too much bare ground, both of those could be achieved by sowing additional seeds as something to help you get towards good condition. Just a very rough example. Adding habitats will be very familiar to people who have used one-click LCA, but essentially you have a a big drop-down list, and there's about 130 different habitats. They have the kind of top level of the hierarchy, and then a dash and the detailed habitat type. So these are all different types of cropland, like agricultural land, and then within all types of cropland, you have different field margins, or you have the actual fields themselves, whether they have cereal crops, or if it's an orchard or horticulture, etc. And you can click the question mark here to open what we would call the data card. And within that, you have a picture example, which in almost every single case is specific to this detailed habitat type. We've searched far and wide to find examples of those habitat types. And then within the description tab here, this is a description of the habitat, which is directly from UKHab, so the provider of the habitat classification system. Some of them are longer than others. It really depends on the habitat, but what would be recommended is, if you aren't really sure enough from this description, go and get this guide from UKHab for free and just have a look at if they provide any other detail, especially what types of species are present, because you can always look at pictures of species and that will help you get an idea. There are also a few cases of habitats that are not within UKHab. They are based on UNIS, which is a habitat system from the European Union. So again, we've got habitat pictures and descriptions from UNIS for those small subsection of habitats. And both of those things are just provided to kind of help people who aren't already ecologists get an idea as to what different habitats look like and what features they should have. So essentially, the way that you would complete an assessment is, if you ignore the created for now, it's very unlikely that your site is just going to be 5 hectares of grassland, but it could be. But you'll probably have more than one thing in your baseline. So you would add all your different habitats. Let's say there's a coastal lagoon right next to a grassland. Maybe not super accurate, but we'll go with it. You add the habitat, add the area. You say what condition it's going to be, which ranges from poor to good, and then you select your significance value. Comment is quite useful, especially if you were comparing like multiple sites within the same assessment. Some like big developers do that for like a portfolio-wide BNG. Otherwise, it's quite useful to just assign like an ID number or something to that like different habitat on the baseline so that you can keep track of it. And then the two inputs here are area retained and area enhanced. So area enhanced is quite intuitive. That's we've got 5 at the beginning, and we're going to enhance 1 hectare of it. So you have 1 in here, and then you go and put 1 in here. For area retained, this is different from enhancement slightly. So we're saying how much of this habitat we're going to keep, and it will still be there post-development, but we're not going to change the condition from poor. And I think many people get confused by this in that they think that means you don't have to do anything, just don't damage it. But you're essentially committing to maintaining it at poor condition, which ideally you should be going above that. But anyway, you're committing to the 2 criteria that you achieve for poor. Those need to be true 30 years from now. So with any BNG assessment, you would have a management plan that shows for 30 years how you're going to do all this. So if we're creating a habitat and we say it's going to be good condition, how explicitly are we going to do that? Similarly, for enhancement and retaining habitats, we need to document how we're going to do those because we've committed to it. In some habitats, you probably won't really have to do very much, but in others, retaining them could lead to like quite significant management. So yeah, in this example, let me just remove this, we don't need coastal lagoon. So we have 5 hectares, we're retaining 3 or 60%, and we're enhancing 1. So we've actually lost 1 hectare here. It hasn't been accounted for. So we're going to create new habitats to fill that 1 hectare of our site. With enhancement, the 1 hectare needs to be 1 hectare. Like, we can't really chop and change them. Like we said, we're going to enhance 1, so that whole 1 hectare should be enhanced as 1. However, for creation, you could divide it into as many different pieces as you want, as long as the total matches that 1 hectare. So we could have like 10 different habitats on here, all 0.1 hectare in size. But for simplicity, we're going to build a small building, or maybe not that small, and then we're going to create some introduced shrub. This is kind of a kind of catch-all habitat for like ornamental type planting that you might see in like a new development or in a garden, that type of thing. Generally non-native species. And then in this example, we've also got a hedge on site, or a line of trees. It's 2 kilometers long. We're going to retain 0.5, and we're going to enhance 1 kilometer of it. So again, we've got 0.5 kilometers to play with, and we'll make a new hedgerow. And then this is the enhancement. We're changing it from moderate condition to good condition. And I'll show you the results page. If it wants to. There we go. So there's quite a lot of information here. This all relates to the different sections, but because we didn't have watercourses and we didn't use off-site, we can just hide those empty ones because they're not useful to us right now. So we have the baseline, created, enhanced, and retained. If you click details, you could go and see exactly how many biodiversity units each one scored. In this case, we just had the 1 grassland, so it's 1 value in here. But the things that people need are these 2 tables at the bottom. So biodiversity gain is essentially the net change in units. So you have everything that was there before development, and then you have everything that was there afterwards, and the number between those 2 numbers is your net gain or net loss. We present that as the whole number because that is needed if you were going to do an assessment, but it's really straightforward to make this a percentage. In this case, our total net change of habitat, 1.85, you would divide that by your baseline units, so 23, which I think off the top of my head is about 0.8, or sorry, 8% gain. So we haven't actually achieved 10% net gain in this case. Whereas for the hedges, I can't do the math that quickly, but that's 1.5 divided by 9.2 is over 10%. So this is like a first iteration. We've got an idea of, based on if we just enhance the grassland and we can only do introduce shrub in a building, we're not going to achieve 10% net gain. So in this case, we would go and do another iteration. And I can't remember what show it's from, but here's one I prepared earlier. This is the same project, the same site. All the habitats are the same, all the areas are the same, and the conditions the same. The only thing I've changed is this input called years in advance / delay. And what this means is when you're creating or enhancing something, there is inherent risk. Like if I say I'm going to create a new woodland, it doesn't just appear. Like you plant trees and it takes, in BNG, in the BNG world, it takes 30 years to actually become a mature woodland. So because of that, you get a negative multiplier that accounts for this risk associated with time, because within those 30 years, lots of things could go wrong. It could fail to establish, for example. However, you have a degree of control over that multiplier, where in this case, I've said the enhancement of the grassland, I'm actually going to start doing that 3 years before I start the construction of the building. So we're going to start sowing seeds, we're going to start management 3 years before. And similarly, even though we already achieved it for the hedges, I'm going to do the same for the hedges because we're already there. So why not improve our gain? And if we go to the results, so the baseline and everything is still the same, but the created is still the same, but the enhanced will be a different value now. And now we've got 2.46. So let's open calculator and make sure. So yeah, we've just achieved 11%-ish net gain without having to change anything of the actual habitats that we're going to do. We just decided that while we're working on the design or something, we can go in and just start preparing the site and enhancing the grassland already, because it's a much better outcome for biodiversity if you already establish these things before development. So that's quite a very quick example. And then I will very quickly show another example. I won't go into too much detail. This is 2 examples of a site where I've tried to keep everything the same, but I've changed the distinctiveness value of most of the habitats on site. So in this example, we've got vacant or derelict land. So think of like a car park that's not being used, or what we might call a brownfield site. It's in moderate condition, but it's not a super valuable habitat. And then we're going to do all of these things. We're not going to do any enhancement. We're just going to clear this and create all of these new things. And all of these habitats are pretty achievable. I've been quite precautionary. I've given everything moderate condition and medium significance, even though some of these would be higher, but just so I don't like over evaluate the net gain. And if we go to the results and hide empty, let's do a little check again. So we haven't really achieved net gain, but we're pretty close. So seeing as we're not actually committing to this right now, that's really useful. Like with the small tweaks, we could easily get that to 10% without we haven't had to do any enhancement. We can completely clear the site and start from scratch. And then I've prepared the same site with some higher value habitats, open mosaic on previously developed land. I could talk for a whole hour about this, but it's a quite complex brownfield site that is surprisingly biodiverse. And because this is quite high value, I've had to enhance it, and I've had to go off-site and create more of the same habitat to even get 10%, because that starting habitat was just worth more than the previous example. And vacant or derelict land can quite easily become open mosaic, and it changes your site drastically. So I won't go into any more detail about that, but that's just a useful example of one of the ways that I would do this early on. It's really quick to just add a new design, and then you can copy the data over using this so that you can create different iterations and just prepare yourself for the future. But yeah, I think for now, that's a good place to stop. And let's go.
Thanks, James. Hopefully that has given everyone a good overview on how the tool works and how it could benefit their developments as well. We've got loads of really good questions, so we'll dive into those in a moment. But just before we do jump into the Q&A, if you want to see a more tailored demo of the tool, or if you want to talk to us about anything else that One-Click LCA could help you with, or any of the other software that we offer, please do just answer the poll that's popped up on your screen right now, and we'll be in touch with you very shortly to arrange that. And so let's get to some of the questions then. We've had some really good questions coming in for you, James, while you've been busy demoing the tool. So first question we want to ask is from Janie. Are there any incentives or deterrents for developers to avoid the offsetting with offsite habitats?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's it kind of splits opinion, but I am very in favor of this. So when you're using an offsite site, you have an extra input that you add that says whether it's inside the same local planning authority, or whether it's adjacent to the local planning authority, or further away. And essentially, simply put, the further you are from your main development site, the bigger penalization you get. So you get a negative multiplier the further you are away. So even if you're doing really good habitat interventions, but your site is 1 million miles away from your offsite is 1 million miles away from your development, you're punished for that essentially, because you've detracted from biodiversity in one location, and even though you've done something really good in another location, you've kind of still caused a loss on a local level. So this is designed to really ensure that compensation is done locally as possible, because biodiversity benefits people and everything as well when you're talking about a new development. So it should be kept as local as possible.
Great, thank you. We had a couple of questions about this next one. So who is independently monitoring the 30-year management plan? How is it ensured that this will be followed, and what are the penalties if it's not? For example, if a management company went bankrupt?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the last point is definitely beyond me to say. But in general, this is something that you would submit with your planning application to the local authority. And it could either be you doing it, or you can enter a covenant with someone and they commit to doing it. But my understanding is that the onus is on the local planning authority to enforce this, because they've granted you planning permission under the understanding that you are going to do these things as you've documented. So unfortunately, I don't actually know off the top of my head what the repercussions are, but the onus is on the planning authority to actually check and enforce these things.
Great, thank you. Next question. The tool is built on UK HAB, but I know other countries are developing their own versions. I believe Scotland will have their own habitat list soon. Will the tool be updated to take in account the new systems as they come available?
Yeah, that's definitely my intention. BNG is definitely not perfect, but I'm a fan of what it achieves. So it's definitely it's not going to be a surprise to me when other countries do something similar. And depending on what Scotland does, using your example, it could either be a modification to this tool that can be used in the UK wide, or a separate tool for Scotland specifically. I don't know the detail, but I imagine they would just adapt UK HAB rather than creating something totally new. But the goal, especially if it's policy driven, would be to provide tools to support people. Yeah.
Great. We had a couple of questions about the tool specifically, so I'll bundle those together. Is the BNG tool an add-on to existing one-click licenses, or completely separate? And does it come on a subscription system, or does it allow for one-off per project?
So I believe it's a standalone tool, because it doesn't work with any of the data of our other tools. It's very standalone in how it works. And unfortunately, I'm the wrong person to ask this, but I believe the payment is based on how all of our other tools work. It's like an annual subscription, and this gives you, like, you can do multiple different projects and multiple different designs within each project as part of that. You don't have a subscription per project, for example. But if you reach out, we can definitely give you more detail on how the pricing would work.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a question from Alice. She asked, planting species and seeds, etc., before the start of construction earns us points, but in reality, it's very risky. There's a risk of damaging or destroying the planted species. Is this risk taken into account in the programme? Isn't it safer to plant once construction is complete?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. That risk isn't necessarily embedded, because you do the earlier you do it, the more positive score you get. So they don't take into account that kind of risk. I would say it's kind of ultimately like up to the developer to do this properly, because if they've said they're going to do something 5 years in advance and they actually do it, they obviously then need to do the construction part of it that takes that into account. Like, they need to be really careful to maintain what they've just done, otherwise they're not doing what they said they would do. So I think that's something that's not easily enforceable, personally. But I would like to think, if a developer's going the extra mile and doing something before development starts, that they will then be conscious of that when they are actually building. I think it's also used as like an incentive, because even though you could argue that it's easier to do all the enhancement or creation after you've like finished the building, this is just one of those things where, without like local or planning authority and like really rigorously enforcing it, you can kind of say one thing on your biodiversity gain plan and then build your building and not bother doing it. I think that's the risk. So incentivizing you to do it earlier, I think it's ultimately like a positive, but it's a good point.
Great, thank you. We have a handful of other questions. So, must this assessment be done for all new buildings in the UK? Is it for all sizes of buildings?
So at the moment, the legislation only applies to England specifically, not the whole of the UK. Although, as the other person mentioned, it's quite likely Scotland will do something similar. It applies differently based on the size of your development. So we have major developments in England, which are, I think it's a development that will have either more than 10 residential units, which that could be flats as well, or if it's not residential, then a site over 1,000 meters squared. I believe that's the criteria for a major development. So there are a few minor exceptions, but basically all of those major developments will have to do this now. And then you also have what they're called small sites, where if it doesn't hit those criteria, you can use a different form of the Biodiversity Net Gain assessment. It's basically the same thing, but you have slightly less data to use, because it's primarily designed for big developments, so the assessment's a bit different. But again, I think that was the start of April that small sites were subject to this, so that now applies. And I think infrastructure projects will be 2025, something like that.
Okay, thank you. One more, well, maybe a couple more. There are many different types of grassland. How can I determine between acidic or calcareous grassland, for example, without being an expert? Yeah,
so if we're going through this process that this webinar has covered, like we're doing a high level assessment, then at that point, it's probably not that useful to actually try and determine that, which maybe that's controversial to say. But as these habitats have distinctiveness value, it doesn't really matter if you choose that. Like, you could just choose a different type of grassland or pick one of them, as long as they have the same distinctiveness value, so that then you get an idea as to what you need to do if you're going to impact it. So if I had calcareous grassland on site, I think off the top of my head that has distinctiveness of 6. So if I was going to lose that, then I already know what I need to do to create that. So if we're just like optioneering, it's not like the end all to know exactly what habitat is.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll just take one more question, and this is from Ivan. Does the tool have the possibility to estimate the negative gains or impacts?
Yes, like if you don't get net gain, it just presents the results as they are. So you can definitely get negative results. Like even if you create and enhance stuff, you can still get negative results at the end if you don't create and enhance the right things. So it just gives it to you straight, basically. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to sneak one final question in, and I heard a lot of talk about this at Footprint Plus last week. Should we be doing this without an ecologist?
Yeah. I definitely know that not every ecologist will agree with me, but I am strongly in favor of people doing this. It just creates a better relationship between stakeholders and ecologists. Like the goal for this is not to replace ecologists, but if you're at the point where you haven't even got a site selected, it might not be feasible to send an ecologist. Like if we're talking about Reba stages, like stage 0, you're just purely in feasibility. It's just to get a different idea as to what some site options might mean for you. And then you could even show those to an ecologist a year down the line or something. I think there's massive value in that. Yeah.
Okay, good. Good point to end on, I think, there. So thanks very much, James. And just a quick note, just to wrap up, really, if you want more information about Biodiversity Net Gain, we've got loads of content available. If you head to our YouTube channel, we have James's session at the Carbon Expert Summit event that took place last month. You can watch that there. We also have an episode of our Carbon Experts Live around preserving and promoting nature in construction, which you can watch on demand. We have a product page on our website, which I linked in the chat, and we have an article on there, a guide to early stage biodiversity net gain assessments, which covers a lot of what we've talked about today. So please feel free to go and check those out. Please do stay in touch with James as well. As you can tell, he's very passionate about this topic. He's always happy to continue the conversation. So please do reach out to him if you have any questions after the event. And that's it from us. So thank you very much. I hope you found it insightful. And as I said, if you do have any other questions or you want to continue the conversation with us, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much.
Thanks.